Part II. Combray. Section 7. I was by no means Bergotte's sole admirer. He was the favorite writer also of a friend of my mother's, a highly literary lady, while Dr. du Boulbon had kept all his patients waiting until he finished Bergotte's latest volume, and it was from his consulting room, and from a house in a park near Combray, that some of the first seeds were scattered of that taste for Bergotte, a rare growth in those days, but now so universally acclimatized that one finds it flowering everywhere throughout Europe and America, and even in the tiniest villages, rare still in its refinement, but in that alone. What my mother's friend, and, it would seem, what Dr. du Boulbon liked above all in the writings of Bergotte, was just what I liked, the same flow of melody, the same old-fashioned phrases, and certain others, quite simple and familiar, but so placed by him in such prominence as to hint at a particular quality of taste on his part; and also, in the sad part of his books, a sort of roughness, a tone that was almost harsh. And he himself, no doubt, realized that these were his principal attractions; for in his later books, if he had hit upon some great truth, or upon the name of an historic cathedral, he would break off his narrative, and in an invocation, an apostrophe, a lengthy prayer, would give a free outlet to that effluence which, in the earlier volumes, remained buried beneath the form of his prose, discernible only in a rippling of its surface, and perhaps even more delightful, more harmonious, when it was thus veiled from the eye, when the reader could give no precise indication of where the murmur of the current began, or of where it died away. These passages in which he delighted were our favorites also. For my own part, I knew all of them by heart. I felt even disappointed when he resumed the thread of his narrative. Whenever he spoke of something whose beauty had until then remained hidden from me, of pine forests, or of hailstorms, of Notre Dame de Paris, or Athalie, or Phèdre, by some piece of imagery he would make their beauty explode and drench me with its essence. And so, dimly realizing that the universe contained innumerable elements which my feeble senses would be powerless to discern, did he not bring them within my reach, I wished that I might have his opinion, some metaphor of his upon everything in the world, and especially upon such things as I might have an opportunity, some day, of seeing for myself, and among such things, more particularly still, upon some of the historic buildings of France, upon certain views of the sea, because the emphasis with which in his books he referred to these showed that he regarded them as rich in significance and beauty. But alas, upon almost everything in the world his opinion was unknown to me. I had no doubt that it would differ entirely from my own, since his came down from an unknown sphere towards which I was striving to raise myself, convinced that my thoughts would have seemed pure foolishness to that perfected spirit. I had so completely obliterated them all that if I happened to find in one of his books something which had already occurred to my own mind, my heart would swell with gratitude and pride, as though some deity had in his infinite bounty restored it to me, had pronounced it to be beautiful and right. It happened now and then that a page of Bergotte would express precisely those ideas which I used often at night, when I was unable to sleep, to write to my grandmother and mother, and so concisely and well that his page had the appearance of a collection of mottoes for me to set at the head of my letters. And so, too, in later years, when I began to compose a book of my own, and the quality of some of my sentences seemed so inadequate that I could not make up my mind to go on with the undertaking, I would find the equivalent of my sentences in Bergotte's. But it was only then, when I read them in his pages, that I could enjoy them. When it was I myself who composed them, in my anxiety that they should exactly reproduce what I seemed to have detected in my mind, and in my fear of their not turning out true to life, I had no time to ask myself whether what I was writing would be pleasant to read. But indeed there was no kind of language, no kind of ideas, which I really liked, except these. My feverish and unsatisfactory attempts were themselves a token of my love, a love which brought me no pleasure, but was, for all that, intense and deep. And so, when I came suddenly upon similar phrases in the writings of another, that is to say, stripped of their familiar accompaniment of scruples and repressions and self-tormentings, I was free to indulge to the full my own appetite for such things, just as a cook who, once in a while, has no dinner to prepare for other people, can then find time to gourmandize himself. And so, when I had found one day, in a book by Bergotte, some joke about an old family servant, to which his solemn and magnificent style added a great deal of irony, but which was in principle what I had often said to my grandmother about Françoise, and when another time I had discovered that he thought not unworthy of reflection, in one of those mirrors of absolute truth which were his writings, a remark similar to one which I had had occasion to make on our friend Monsieur Legrandin. And moreover, my remarks on Françoise and Monsieur Legrandin were among those which I would most resolutely have sacrificed for Bergotte's sake, in the belief that he would find them quite without interest. Then it was suddenly revealed to me that my own humble existence and the realms of truth were less widely separated than I had supposed, that at certain points they were actually in contact, and in my new found confidence and joy I wept upon his printed page as in the arms of a long lost father. From his books I had formed an impression of Bergotte as a frail and disappointed old man, who had lost his children and had never found any consolation. And so I would read, or rather sing his sentences in my brain, with rather more dolce, rather more lento than he himself had, perhaps intended, and his simplest phrase would strike my ears with something peculiarly gentle and loving in its intonation. More than anything else in the world I cherished his philosophy, and had pledged myself to it in lifelong devotion. It made me impatient to reach the age when I should be eligible to attend the class at school called philosophy. I did not wish to learn or to do anything else there, but simply to exist and be guided entirely by the mind of Bergotte. And if I had been told then that the metaphysicians whom I was actually to follow there resembled him in nothing, I should have been struck down by the despair a young lover feels who has sworn lifelong fidelity when a friend speaks to him of the other mistresses he will have in time to come. One Sunday, while I was reading in the garden, I was interrupted by Swann, who had come to call upon my parents. "What are you reading? May I look?" "Why, it's Bergotte. Who has been telling you about him?" I replied that Bloch was responsible. "Oh, yes, that boy I saw here once, who looks so like the Bellini portrait of Mahomet too. It's an astonishing likeness. He has the same arched eyebrows and hooked nose and prominent cheek bones. When his beard comes, he'll be Mahomet himself. Anyhow, he has good taste, for Bergotte is a charming creature." And seeing how much I seemed to admire Bergotte, Swann, who never spoke at all about the people he knew, made an exception in my favor and said, "I know him well. If you would like him to write a few words on the title page of your book, I could ask him for you." I dared not accept such an offer, but bombarded Swann with questions about his friend. "Can you tell me, please, who is his favorite actor?" "Actor? No, I can't say. But I do know this: there's not a man on the stage whom he thinks equal to Berma. He puts her above every one. Have you seen her?" "No, sir. My parents do not allow me to go to the theatre." "That is a pity. You should insist. Berma in Phædra, in the Cid." "Well, she's only an actress, if you like, but you know that I don't believe very much in the hierarchy of the arts." As he spoke I noticed, what had often struck me before in his conversations with my grandmother's sisters, that whenever he spoke of serious matters, whenever he used an expression which seemed to imply a definite opinion upon some important subject, he would take care to isolate, to sterilize it by using a special intonation, mechanical and ironic, as though he had put the phrase or word between inverted commas, and was anxious to disclaim any personal responsibility for it, as who should say the hierarchy, don't you know, as silly people call it. But then if it was so absurd, why did he say the hierarchy? A moment later he went on, "Her acting will give you as noble an inspiration as any masterpiece of art in the world, as, oh, I don't know," and he began to laugh, "shall we say the queens of Chartres?" Until then I had supposed that his horror of having to give a serious opinion was something Parisian and refined, in contrast to the provincial dogmatism of my grandmother's sisters. and I had imagined also that it was characteristic of the mental attitude towards life of the circle in which Swann moved, where, by a natural reaction from the lyrical enthusiasms of earlier generations, an excessive importance was given to small and precise facts, formerly regarded as vulgar, and anything in the nature of phrase making was banned. But now I found myself slightly shocked by this attitude which Swann invariably adopted when face to face with generalities. He appeared unwilling to risk even having an opinion, and to be at his ease only when he could furnish with meticulous accuracy some precise but unimportant detail. But in so doing he did not take into account that even here he was giving an opinion, holding a brief, as they say, for something, that the accuracy of his details had an importance of its own. I thought again of the dinner that night, when I had been so unhappy because Mamma would not be coming up to my room, and when he had dismissed the balls given by the Princesse de Léon as being of no importance. And yet it was to just that sort of amusement that he was devoting his life. For what other kind of existence did he reserve the duties of saying in all seriousness what he thought about things, of formulating judgments which he would not put between inverted commas? And when would he cease to give himself up to occupations of which at the same time he made out that they were absurd? I noticed, too, in the manner in which Swann spoke to me of Bergotte, something which, to do him justice, was not peculiar to himself, but was shared by all that writer's admirers at that time, at least by my mother's friend, and by Dr. Du Boulon. Like Swann, they would say of Bergotte, "He has a charming mind, so individual. He has a way of his own of saying things, which is a little far-fetched, but so pleasant. You never need to look for his name on the title page, you can tell his work at once." But none of them had yet gone so far as to say, "He is a great writer, he has great talent." They did not even credit him with talent at all. They did not speak because they were not aware of it. We are very slow in recognizing in the peculiar physiognomy of a new writer the type which is labeled great talent in our museum of general ideas. Simply because that physiognomy is new and strange, we can find in it no resemblance to what we are accustomed to call talent. We say rather originality, charm, delicacy, strength, and then one day we add up the sum of these and find that it amounts simply to talent. "Are there any books in which Bergotte has written about Berma?" I asked Monsieur Swann. "I think he has in that little essay on Racine, but it must be out of print. Still, there has perhaps been a second impression. I will find out. Anyhow, I can ask Bergotte himself all you want to know next time he comes to dine with us. He never misses a week, from one year's end to another. He is my daughter's greatest friend. They go about together and look at old towns and cathedrals and castles." As I was still completely ignorant of the different grades in the social hierarchy, the fact that my father found it impossible for us to see anything of Swann's wife and daughter had for a long time had the contrary effect of making me imagine them as separated from us by an enormous gulf, which greatly enhanced their dignity and importance in my eyes. I was sorry that my mother did not dye her hair and redden her lips, as I had heard our neighbor, Madame Sazerat, say that Madame Swann did, to gratify not her husband, but Monsieur de Charlus, and I felt that to her we must be an object of scorn, which distressed me particularly on account of the daughter, such a pretty little girl, as I had heard, and one of whom I used often to dream, always imagining her with the same features and appearance, which I bestowed upon her quite arbitrarily, but with a charming effect. But from this afternoon, when I had learned that Mademoiselle Swann was a creature living in such rare and fortunate circumstances, bathed, as in her natural element, in such a sea of privilege, that if she should ask her parents whether any one were coming to dinner, she would be answered in those two syllables, radiant with celestial light, would hear the name of that golden guest who was to her no more than an old friend of her family, Bergotte, that for her the intimate conversation at table, corresponding to what my great aunt's conversation was for me, would be the words of Bergotte upon all those subjects which he had not been able to take up in his writings, and on which I would fain have heard him utter oracles, and that, above all, when she went to visit other towns, he would be walking by her side, unrecognized and glorious, like the gods who came down of old from heaven to dwell among mortal men. Then I realized both the rare worth of a creature such as Mademoiselle Swann, and at the same time how coarse and ignorant I should appear to her. And I felt so keenly how pleasant and yet how impossible it would be for me to become her friend, that I was filled at once with longing and with despair. And usually from this time forth, when I thought of her, I would see her standing before the porch of a cathedral, explaining to me what each of the statues meant, and, with a smile which was my highest commendation, presenting me as her friend to Bergotte. And invariably the charm of all the fancies which the thought of cathedrals used to inspire in me, the charm of the hills and valleys of the Ile de France and of the plains of Normandy, would radiate brightness and beauty over the picture I had formed in my mind of Mademoiselle Swann. Nothing more remained but to know and to love her. Once we believe that a fellow creature has a share in some unknown existence to which that creature's love for ourselves can win us admission, that is, of all the preliminary conditions which love exacts, the one to which he attaches most importance, the one which makes him generous or indifferent as to the rest. Even those women who pretend that they judge a man by his exterior only, see in that exterior an emanation from some special way of life. And that is why they fall in love with a soldier or a fireman, whose uniform makes them less particular about his face. They kiss and believe that beneath the crushing breastplate there beats a heart different from the rest, more gallant, more adventurous, more tender. And so it is that a young king or a crown prince may travel in foreign countries and make the most gratifying conquests, and yet lack entirely that regular and classic profile which would be indispensable, I dare say, in an outside broker. End of Part Two, Section 7.